Hello, everyone. My name is Mei-Ying, and I am the King's Business Club Keynote Project Lead. This event has been specifically created for students who are starting out in their career journeys. You can find our past and our future keynotes on the KBC YouTube channel. Today, we are working in collaboration with our publications department to celebrate the launch of the King's Business Review. The King's Business Review is a homegrown online publication platform that stimulates the exchange of ideas to inspire the next generation. It's essentially a modern lyceum on topics including finance, politics, science and tech, art, and more. KBR is where business meets the rest of the world. If you would like to contribute to our publications, please reach out to us via our website or social media. The links are provided in the description box below. In line with discussing important world events, we are really excited to announce our guest speaker today, Jason Palmer. I'm sure you'll recognize his voice when he introduces himself, as Jason is the current podcast host of the Economist, The Intelligence Podcast. Jason will be providing advice and answers to all of your questions, so please remember to make use of the Q&A feature of this keynote. You can submit questions throughout the discussion for Jason to address during question time. Now I will hand over to Jason to introduce himself.
Hi, thanks, Mei-Ying. I'm to give a potted history of my career so far. So I originally did undergraduate degrees in physics and mathematics at the University of Florida. I sought a job then thinking I wouldn't be going to get a postgrad. So I got a job at Lawrence Livermore National Lab in California, working on some laser-based research, let's call it, but realized I did want to go back and sort of make my way in science by getting a postgrad degree. I was working with someone at the time who had come from Imperial College, and he was headed back that way and asked if I wanted to be a student. So that's what brought me to London in the first place. And in the course of doing my PhD, as I think happens to quite a lot of PhD students, I got a little bit down, a little bit disillusioned with it. And I started to think of what I might do with the skills that I had that weren't on a strictly academic track. And cutting a long story short, and we may come to this, I settled on science writing, science journalism. But I was given some advice not to sort of bet the farm on it. So I took up a postdoc and then started freelancing in my free time. And I just loved it. I started to get clips, started to get publications, started to see my name in lights and what have you. So I pursued a couple of internships back in the UK when I was finished the postdoc in Italy, and managed to get two, one at New Scientist and one at The Economist. And from there, got a kind of a lucky break in the side door for what was supposed to be a four-week gig at the BBC. And I ended up being there for 5 years because I, in part, refused to leave. From there, I ended up doing a fellowship at MIT, run by the Knight Foundation, specifically for science journalists. And then when I came back, quite luckily, the position of science and technology correspondent was open at The Economist, and I applied for that and got in there. I was doing that for about 2 years, I suppose, before I was approached to edit Espresso. We have a daily morning briefing kind of app, and they asked me if I wanted to give that a go, and that felt like a real change and a way to sort of spread my wings. So I, against my better judgment in a way, decided, sure, I'll do that. And then just about exactly 2 years after that, we started talking about a daily podcast, and I got very much in at the ground floor of that, and have now been doing that for, well, not counting the long piloting period, a couple of years.
Thank you, Jason. So you mentioned that you did your PhD in molecular physics, and you also did a degree in math. A couple of students were kind of wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing how you went from the change from this kind of sciencey background into the journalistic field, and how you made yourself more employable while being at uni, and how you landed those first few internships, and yeah, how you got started.
Well, I would love to tell you that it was the product of an extremely rigorous 5-year plan, and I hit every bullet point and what have you. But in truth, the shift to journalism was late in the game, was very much towards the end of my PhD. and we can get into this if you like about this. I just didn't see being really happy with the academic track that lay ahead of me. And I did think about, I've kind of always liked writing anyway. And so I just tried to think of what I could do. I got some very good advice from John Emsley, a science writer you might know, essentially about that, don't quit your day job. In truth, I've met a lot of people since who had a better idea earlier on about what it is they wanted to do, and certainly, writing for the school paper, we had a very well-known one at Imperial called Felix, and plenty of, in fact, two great science writers I know of were actually editors of Felix in their day. There was also a master's program at Imperial in science communication that, essentially I had excuse me, I'd expended all of my appetite for further education and all of my money. So I kind of decided quite stubbornly just to kind of press ahead, and I'll be able to break into this. So on the score of what did I do to make myself more employable, girded my loins and was very determined, I think is the only thing I can name. Though I did have, with a very good friend of mine, a radio show on Imperial College Radio that eventually got syndicated nationally, though I don't think that was an explicit career help. It just made me a little less nervous when sitting in front of a microphone.
That's come into handy. It's very handy now that you have your job. So we will give some time so that the live viewer questions can come in, but I thought that we would start off with the questions that we've received on Instagram. So first off, in a daily podcast that covers the whole world, how do you decide what to discuss and what to leave out? Do you feel some sense of responsibility to shed light on current events that otherwise might not get the coverage that they deserve?
Well, first thing I should say is that it's not me doing the deciding. We have a big team, and the buck stops with the editors. The show has two editors. Early on in the show, I had a lot more involvement in sort of choosing the story slate and so on. And there are a lot of kind of practical considerations as to what to put in a particular day and across the week. But remember that we're starting from a particular, we've got a bounded set, right? Our stories come from the stories that the Economist's journalists are working on anyway, right? So it's very few sort of self-generated stories. And so with that grand palette of stories, it's not an infinite set. We can't just say, oh, we'd really like to do a story on X. We do need, to speak to a correspondent who's looking into it. We're just kind of channeling that for the show. And it's about a matter of variety, right? On a given day, if your top story is about Asian business, then you don't want another Asian or business story as the second. And so there's kind of a constantly shifting grid of stories such that you get a trip around the world and across subjects in a given day. And then you try to, of course, kind of cover a little bit of everything in the course of a week, all the while being mindful of what the big news stories are on any given day. So it's it's not like you set out with a plan on Monday and this is everything we're going to do from Friday. I mean, it is honestly, it's shifting from hour to hour. On the point of a feeling an obligation to cover this versus that and so on, I think absolutely yes, and that comes from the time I spent on Espresso, and I think that the editors share this view that the news market is absolutely saturated, right? The big stories, of course, we do have to cover, but maybe we don't have to cover in extraordinary depth. Maybe it's not necessarily the top story, or it's not the top story 2 or 3 or 4 days in a row, as it might be certain, national elections recently, for example. So I always liked on Espresso visiting places that you're not getting news from. Stories that aren't in the headlines but should be is kind of one of the taglines that early on in the show we had, that sense of, I know you're going to get everything that you need to know about those really, really big stories. I want to tell you about the really big story that we're not hearing. So absolutely, yes, there's a feeling that we should dig a little deeper and give people stuff that they're not getting elsewhere, not least because, these days there's that sort of like consolidation of attention and, stuff gets missed and it shouldn't.
I have an interesting question. You mentioned that you're in a team. I just wondered how many people are in the team that are working for your podcast.
Right. So there are 2 editors and then a number of producers. We share some producers. So it's on the order of 5, 6 producers because The Economist has several other podcasts and, they kind of go between the different shows, and 1 sound engineer. So whatever that adds up to, it's on the order of 10.
Okay. I was just wondering because it's a very big well, for students like me who listen to it a lot, it's a very successful podcast. It's something that our teachers tell us to listen to. So it's nice to hear the behind the scenes of it. But linking on from the previous question, so you have such a quick turnaround for these podcasts. It's daily. How much time does the team take in preparing a single recording? Could you walk us through a day in the office or at home at the moment?
Here. So the team is absolutely crucial. I get, I get all the attention, all the plaudits, but really it is, it's the behind the scenes that make it. And time to do a single recording is almost, it's an impossible question to answer because everything is done extremely piecemeal. In a general sense, the editors choose the slate of stories, right? Each story then, we have 3 segments in the show. Each one of those stories will then be assigned to a producer, and a producer will in turn get in touch with the correspondent who's written the story that we're kind of basing the piece on. And they will they will have a chat with that correspondent. They will put together kind of basically a brief, a loose script on the basis of the piece that's been written. And kind of formulate that into how a series of questions and answers can kind of follow on from one another and cover all that same ground. That gets approved then by the editors. I get to see it. We kind of have a fairly informal chat between us all on like, wouldn't it be better if this question came first or this was like that? And that seems the distraction. And wait a minute, you've forgotten this bit. And it kind of, it sort of gets honed down. And then we set a time with the correspondent, and I, sit and do the sort of the actual Q&A part. And then sometimes the plan is followed to the letter. More often than not, you realize in conversation that it'd be more sensible to do this before that, or you mentioned something that wasn't mentioned in the piece because, of course, everything's edited, and they've done reporting that could have been for a piece 5, 6, 10 times as long. But in any case, then you have like the meat of it, right? All of the tape is there. The producer, long-suffering producer, then goes off and cuts that down into 6, 7, 8 minutes or so, bounces edits back and forth between the editor, and then we kind of collaborate on writing the top bit. So all this to say that it's in very discrete pieces that are spread out over all kinds of time, right? We have to get the correspondents when they are available, and we can't work all of the hours of the day. Many of them are in places all over the world, so it kind of gets done in a piecemeal fashion, with the exception of those lead stories that are the really newsy ones that happen on the morning, in which case all of those steps just get squashed down and have to happen in sort of 3 hours. So broadly, the day, my day in the office is everything between very early morning and 11 o'clock is getting the show ready to go out the door. And then afternoons are spent kicking around scripts and actually doing the interviews.
So when you're working, I guess you work pretty closely then with your team every day. When you're doing your recording and things like that, are they listening to you when you're speaking, or you're just given free for all for what questions to ask? Like, you just go with the flow of a conversation, or do you?
It's a balance. I try to think of so the producer is always on the line. The editors have basically sort of then farmed it out to me and the producer, and then the correspondent. And I try to think of the producer as they're the boss in that moment. They have the ear to hear like, oh, I can cut that there and I can cut that there. And so I try to leave them in charge. But yeah, I mean, it is fairly free form. And like I say, we frequently come across things that, oh, that's interesting, we should pursue that. Or, oh, I haven't ever heard it put that way before. Could you, or can you say it again, but slightly, because some people speak in that really, they're not thinking about a 6-minute podcast piece, right? They're thinking about an hour-long interview streamed on YouTube.
On the KBC YouTube channel.
So it is flexible in the moment, but ultimately the bounds remain the same, right? It has to fit into the slot that fits into the show.
A very common question that was sent in was, the majority of the students that are going to be listening to this are interested in a career in journalism, and a lot of them are asking, what is some quick and dirty advice that you'd give them if they want to start a career? So you mentioned a little bit about joining a uni journal or a uni newsletter or some sort of society where they can practice their writing skills and their potential podcast skills, but do you have any other pieces of advice that you would give them?
I suppose I have less advice about podcasting and broadcasting, except on the real nitty gritty stuff. I mean, I'm kind of spiritually, I'm more of a writer, I suppose. And I guess the question is is whether this is a writing advice question, a kind of like how to go about pitching and what have you, or about how to get ahead in the industry. On the latter point, I'm not sure I have a whole lot to add. It is an extremely dynamic industry, and like every other, it's in complete tumult at the moment. So I think I don't have nearly as much to add as on the sort of on the writing part of things, because I've been both a freelancer when I was postdocing and a staff writer, and also an editor in the form of Espresso and so on. So I've kind of seen this from all directions, and I think the sort of the real take home message, or some take home messages, are let's see. Never be precious about your copy, right? Everybody needs an editor, and some people have gone very wrong in my experience by saying, oh, you shouldn't cut that one, have you? Fulfill all of your promises. If you are asked to file 1,000 words, then don't file. I mean, give yourself maybe 10%, right? But don't file 2,000. Meet every deadline, and just basically be a kind of a reliable pair of hands. Be thorough, and don't sort of push back on the editing process. And I think just really think about writing, and sort of forming an argument in writing, and know that writing is rewriting, right? Everybody is, I think, and me most of all when I first got started, very susceptible to the idea of, oh, well, look, I've written scientific papers. I know how to write. That should be easy. And I didn't, and I was terrible. And it took, it took the helping hand of some people who didn't owe me the time to kind of help me get better at it. And so I think it's being open-minded about the things you think you can do, and know that it's, whatever comes first out onto the page isn't going to be, shouldn't be the thing you call done, I suppose.
Another common question that kind of links onto that is, does every journalist have to be skilled at public speaking or writing? Because you say that your heart's in the writing, but you're also a very good public speaker. So in your experience, have you found that to be a successful journalist, you have to be skilled in both?
I think for this audience, it will be helpful to hear no. No, the answer is just plainly no. So I thought about it when I was first getting into the business, and again, it was looking from the outside in and trying to imagine. You imagine that people who are the staff writers at well-known titles must be great at three things, right? So having a nose for news, knowing what a story is, and being able to identify, like, this is a story that needs to be told. I imagined that they were fantastic reporters, right? So that when they actually got that commission, they go looking to find, the answers to the questions and tell the story and so on, that they leave no stone unturned. They ask all the right people. They get a good balance of opinions, what have you. And that when they sit down with all that information and all those interviews, that they spool out the most beautiful lyrical copy that needs, very little work and what have you. And the truth is, I have found, without trying to slur any of my past or present colleagues, I think you can get away with being really very, very good with just one of those and kind of passable in the others, right? Because really good nose for news people, like editors, love them, right? Editors can rewrite, and they can find holes in the reporting and say, can you go back and ask these questions and so on. Or the absolutely dogged reporter who doesn't know what a great story is, but you give them one. Hey, why don't you go off to Elbonia and report this story and so on, and they come back with just like the best material. And then there are writers, people who are just sort of natural writers and kind of get through and can with a helping hand and so on, but then when they get the copy, it's just like, yes, this is what I wanted. So no, in that broadest journalistic writing type stuff, you don't have to be an absolute amazing any one of those things. As for the public speaking, you'd be astonished at how many great journalists are terrible speakers who kind of mumble all the time, and they talk really too long about something and really don't very much inspire anything. So like it's a weird mix that ends up in journalism. Obviously, when I was at the BBC, broadcaster types, a very self-selecting group of good public speakers. But I think on average, I think the important point here is, if you're not great at any one of those things, do not be discouraged, because it is not limiting in the long run.
That is very nice to hear. Someone who's dyslexic, I mean, I would say when I'm looking for stories and things like that to report back, that's often where I find more interesting. I find it hard to get all my things out on the paper, but with the King's Business Review that we have in the publications department, we have people that then go over and edit what's been written. So I guess it's kind of it sounds like it's just a grander version of that in reality when you go into the world of work. But you've had a very successful career, and during those times, students were wondering if you'd had any setbacks and kind of how you overcame those. And I feel like quite an interesting point would be, you mentioned that you did freelance work and now you also work for The Economist. So comparing the two, it'd be quite interesting to see what it's like working as a freelance and what it's like working now, and how you compare those.
Well, I mean, certainly earliest days of freelancing, as in starting from nil, was certainly, I mean, that was setback central, right? And it's something I did take some time, you know, when I got this postdoc and I sat down and I go, okay, cool, I'm going to become a writer. And I bought all the books about writing and field guides for journalists and all this sort of thing. And I made it, you know, because I was an academic, I made it into kind of an academic project.
Yeah.
Like you can read your way through this. And the advice, what sort of emerged, the sort of the theme that came out of a lot of this stuff is just be prepared to be discouraged. I remember one saying, you know, expect one commission for every 20 pitches, which is like damnably discouraging, right? 20 times to get one commission and so on. So I think in terms of setbacks, of that they came thick and fast and repeatedly. And I think, you know, just a dogged determination, as with so many other things, is the way to go. I should say that my getting the job at The Economist was my second go round at it. I had applied 4 years before and got really close, but didn't get it. And, you know, I think both in terms of and this is going to be news to absolutely no one who's watching, but I think in both the rejection of a pitch or rejection of a piece kind of category and the not getting the job category, it was helpful in all cases to get that sort of after the fact feedback. So one of the first regular gigs I had writing was for a magazine called Materials Today. I initially pitched something for their kind of like, you know, new writers contest, and I didn't win. And in retrospect, I didn't deserve to win. But I did go back to the editor and I said, you know, tell me where I went wrong. And she was just like really lovely, really helpful, really kind of good with the sort of didactic, you know, here's where this went wrong and here's where you should do what have you. And, you know, I ended up kind of building quite a relationship with her, and I ended up writing for them for, you know, off and on, but for 4 or 5 years, essentially on the back of what did I do wrong? You know, ditto with the job at The Economist. The first time I didn't get it, it was some disappointment, but you know, I went back to the folks who had interviewed me and said, you know, any sort of feedback and so on, tried to keep in touch and leave them with a good taste in their mouths and so on. And I think that had a lot to do with the fact that I eventually did get the job.
And I feel like it's quite important when you mentioned about almost you could see your previous person as like a mentor, someone to kind of guide you through that process and help you teach you how to write better, essentially.
Yeah.
Would you suggest then, when people are applying to these jobs, to then follow up and ask why they didn't get it? Is that because I know for a lot of like you say, so you're applying to 20 jobs, you might only get one. Would you follow up all 20 and say why not? Is that something that you did?
Well, I mean, it depends on at which hurdle you fall, right? If you get brought in for a second interview, then I think you've got a lot of license for that sort of thing. But if, like, you know, the CV went in the pile and you just didn't make that first cut, then maybe not, right? You don't want, nor does anyone want to become known as an abject pain in the bottom, right? But I think it should be like, as long as it's not delivered in an aggressive way, it's a genuinely, curiously, you know, a period of self-growth kind of question, you know, good faith, you know, what should I take away from this? I don't think anybody would turn that away.
No, that's comforting to hear. With we've got a quick question here. Apart from the Intelligence podcast, what podcast would you recommend? I feel like as a podcast host, there's a high standard that you must have.
No, because I mean, look, if I had been born and raised and trained, you know, with 3 degrees in podcast hosting, that'd be one thing. But this is just kind of this is just the last couple of years of my life. And I think if you ask anybody, even real, you know, real professionals at this, that you'll get a real diverse thing. Because at the end of the day, podcasts are very personal, right? And so they, you know, one's listening habits will reflect, you know, personal things. For mine, I like quite a lot of actual sound, podcast journalism related ones, CJR's The Kicker, How Sound from Transom, that sort of thing, that I don't think is particularly useful for all and sundry. But I'm a big sucker for true crime, as I know a lot of people are. I like quirky histories. So there's one from Business Insider called Brought to You By, just like the backstory on brands that you know, for example. To come up with a recent one that really grabbed me, that I think is just absolutely bonkers and lovely, was Wind of Change. Have you heard of that?
I have not, no.
Essentially on a big, long sort of investigative piece based on the suggestion that Scorpion song called Wind of Change from the 90s was actually a CIA project to spread democracy to Russia. And they take hours and hours to get this out, and it's done with serious Watergate level of investigation stuff to chase whether this like really kind of cheesy pop tune was actually a CIA creation.
I can imagine dissecting each lyric and being like, well, this actually has meaning towards that. That sounds like a good listen. I will definitely check that out. So a previous correspondent on The Daily Show said that they have to leave their soul at the door before they walk into the newsroom. How do you handle the emotional toll that your job takes on you? So how much news is too much news for your soul? So you mentioned that I know that you don't necessarily pick what subjects you speak about, but I'm guessing when you're interviewing these people and they might not accidentally, but they'll bring up something that is potentially quite hard to take. A lot of the time, people who are interviewing have to speak about it again to really get it clear and make them digest the news as well. How much news is too much news for yourself?
Well, I think there's two questions there. Is how to deal with it when the news is personally affecting, is troubling, is emotive, and how much news is too much news. I think is a separate question, because even with a kind of neutral valence, there can be such a thing as too much news. On the matter of the really personally troubling stuff, yeah, you kind of the checking one's soul at the door, I think, works to a degree, but I think you'd have to be a sociopath to be able to do that 100%. You have to do it to a degree. But I think especially this year, there's an indication that we all have that within us, right? We are constantly talking about tens of thousands, millions of deaths about something that is in the news all the time. And without sounding I don't want to sound too base about this, but like it can't be deeply personally affecting at every time that you think about that, because the truth of the horror of that is no less real, from one day to the next. And so I think we all know that we can kind of check a bit of our souls in that regard. Saying that, I have been on stories before that we had a big cover package a few weeks ago about the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And there was a lot of deep reporting. There was a lot of tape. There were a lot of people telling their tales. And, they weren't in English, but you could hear the emotion in them. And you ended up listening to a lot of them. And you hear these stories. And I'm talking to the correspondent both on and off the recording about kind of what he found and how he found what he found and so on. And honestly, I'm not ashamed to admit that in the course of tracking, very late in the game, the part where you write the script at the top and you just kind of like try to tell the tale that gets you into the actual interview, and I just had to have a little cry because it was because the sort of the weight of all of it kind of did get to be too much. I don't know that that's avoidable. Again, notwithstanding being a sociopath. Coming to the other question of how much news is too much news, because I do think it's separate, is you just have to choose. I have to choose when to stop consuming it, and to know that, like, to recognize that little 1 minute trip into the Twitter hellscape has now turned into 25, and I should probably stop, right? Or I take quite an interest in American news for obvious reasons, and there's a lot of hate reads out there. There's a lot of things that are just, I'm just reading this piece that confirms all of my all of my worst fears and hatreds about this situation or person or what have you. And you just have to realize, I have to realize that you get the stories that you need to understand what's going on in the world, and don't kind of dive into it. And at some point, just turn off the alerts. At some point, say, I'm not going to pick up the phone. not going to open the laptop. I'm not going to consume more content, put some music on, do the dishes, and leave it behind for a bit. I'm doing a lot more of that now than I did, say, 5 years ago.
Do you think because of your job that you have to be more stringent on your rules and sharper on your timings and turning off your notifications than your family and your friends, and not your colleagues, but I guess your colleagues are potentially doing the same as well? Would you say?
I mean, I think so. It's a very personal thing. Everybody has to deal with it in their own way, and I think quite a lot of people. I mean, there's a certain pathology here of the news junkie, right? The kind of person who doesn't have much control over it, wants to consume that and so on, without prejudice to the sort of the emotive value of it. Just like needs to know all of the stories as soon as they happen all the time. Mercifully, I've not suffered from that, and so. Like there's a certain amount that's professionally required of me, and there's a certain amount that it certainly fits my interest, my kind of like intellectual magpie thing. I just want to kind of just know all of these sorts of different things and so on. But I do luckily find it fairly easy just to kind of mix up a drink and call it done.
When you were mentioning about writing the top story for the Uyghur Muslim story, I find it it's very interesting how you would have to, I guess, writing the story and then you have to. That doesn't sound, I mean, when I listen to your podcast, they don't sound scripted. Of course they are, but they don't sound like how you would hear an advert, for example. And I feel like that process must be quite interesting, whether it's through practice that you have done over the years of doing your podcast, that it's become quite natural with your intonations and things like this. Do you pretend that there's someone else that you're speaking to, or how do you feel comfortable when you're doing this?
I mean, part of it, the truth is, I guess we're going to reveal all of the stage secrets here, but part of it is necessarily voice acting, right? So if the top story is about, death and destruction in Ruritania, and then you kind of move on to a story later in the show that is about some goofy thing that's, that's a weirdly popular product in Elbonia, and, it's obviously goofy and the music is goofy and so on, the delivery will be different. But, remember that all happens separately, right? I use the mic that's just out of shot here, and I'm kind of crammed into the spare room closet because that's where the sound is best. And I have to sort of just like conjure that, right? And that's true for everybody who does this business, all your broadcasters, and people in the field and podcasters and so on. You just kind of have to match what you kind of, it's voice acting. It's as simple as that. And is it a matter of, and there's probably a frustrated actor in me, so I probably enjoy indulging that when that's actually happening. But sometimes it's quite serious, right? The Uyghurs, one a great example. We do really beautiful obituaries, and I only have one line at the top and the bottom and so on. But but it has to be quite. I have to be quite calm about it, and quite serious about it. Like you just learn how to sort of switch the moods, honestly. And then that in turn is different from the sort of question tone, which is more or less the tone of voice that I've got now, the sort of like just, no, I don't imagine a listener. I maybe I should. But the advice in particular for script writing has always been, write it the way you'd say it if you were telling a friend, if you were telling a story. The natural human inclination, both I think in just print writing, but also in script writing until you learn better, is to be lofty, right? To use really fancy words and sort of complicated locutions and throw in knowledge and draw from classical literature and all that kind of business. And at the end of the day, I think what appeals to a lot of people and what keeps a lot more people on board is when you tell it the way it is within reason, and you ask the questions that you imagine the woman on the street would ask. You don't just say, you don't have that question that has a whole bunch of knowledge packed into it, so I can show you how much I know about this. You just say, well, wait a minute, what you just said. I stop the interviews all the time because, the plan has it that I'm going to ask this, I'm going to get this kind of answer. And then the next thing would be this kind of question to get this kind of answer and so on. And I hear something and I just have that thought of, now, wait a minute. If I didn't know anything about this, my natural next question would be, and 9 times out of 10, that's the way it ends up getting edited, because there is a certain power of just thinking. I mean, in that regard, maybe I am, in fact, thinking about an audience in the form of the questioning and the way an interview plays out. I am thinking about, the sort of the person on the street and what they would reckon, starting from 0 at the start of the story. The script writing, I'm just indulging the inner actor.
When you speak about recording at home, do you have a studio, or you've got the mic that you're using today, but do you use any soundproofing, or do you actually go into the closet?
You thought I was joking about the closet, didn't you?
I
No.
did. I just wanted to check.
I don't know if you can hear it now, but can you hear that sounds echoey?
Mm-hmm.
That's bad for proper recording purposes. It shouldn't sound echoey, and that's why actual recording studios have foam on the walls and so on, so that there aren't all those reflections. How to go about this? I'll tell you an embarrassing and true story. When lockdown first happened, it just very suddenly overnight we had to make the show from home, dispersed, right? But fine, we do a lot of the stuff on Slack anyway. We'll be able to do it. How am I going to do this? I ended up in the kitchen under 2 blankets, right over me, laptop under there, recorder, Zoom recorder, and it was just ludicrous. Not least because 2 people working now in the home office and so on, and a lot of my working day I needed to be pretty quiet. And the solution ended up being the spare room closet, which is it's a modest house with a modest spare room with an even more modest closet. I don't fit in there. I can just about pull the doors closed behind me. But because it's nothing but clothing and soft stuff in there, it sounds really good. So that is my home studio. Now, you'll be able to go online and find lots of actual professional podcasters and broadcasters and NPR and BBC types who have really good sort of sound shielding things and so on. I suppose I might be able to do that. I think I'd have to go to some lengths to make it just as good as it is just a step in the closet. So I've just kind of left it at that.
Yeah, I think that's quite nice. It's very humble. You've come across very humble. So I can just imagine you kind of squeezing into but yeah, if you get the good sound, that's what the sound editors want at the end of the day.
We suffer for our art.
Yeah, I can imagine your wife coming in and then just seeing you in the kitchen underneath the blankets. Just, okay, I'll just walk quietly through.
Avoiding the squeaky floorboard and the whole thing, yes.
Oh yeah, that's a nightmare. So another question was, how did the Intelligence podcast come about? So it's been going on for a couple of years, but I feel like the career progression is quite interesting. Because you mentioned how you had been an editor of Espresso before. Was that just like a natural, they thought, oh, you know what, Jason would be perfect for this? Just kind of, was it like an offered job or?
Couple of things there. I think the wild success of the New York Times Daily was kind of got every legacy print operation thinking about doing daily podcast stuff. The buzz around podcasts had already been around for a while, and the fact that you kind of take a staid print operation and spin out something as popular as that, everybody was going to take notice. Everybody since has got a daily podcast. In a sense, it was an inevitability. We had somebody who was working in the audio department. We've had podcasts for years, by the way, but just only recently, the daily one. She has since departed for another job, but she had the vision at the time that like we could do this, we should do this. This is clearly, plainly a good thing for us to do, and kind of got a remit to sort of game it out. Meanwhile, I was editing Espresso, but I had always been kind of a friend of the audio department anyway. I had come from the BBC. I had some, broadcast experience. When the science and technology podcast Babbage, that show's host went off on book leave, it brought me in just to host that. I had been a guest on Babbage a bunch of times when I was a science and technology correspondent. I had done a couple of our editors picks and tasting menu, a couple of other podcasts, one since defunct. But like I was kind of known to the department, right? The kind of person you could just hand a script to and get a reasonable recording out of. So that helped a lot. And I think the Espresso thing did help a lot too. I had very much spread my wings from being just science nerd guy to somebody who could kind of handle the the breadth, if not great depth, right, but the real breadth of world news. And I certainly felt that way myself. I felt that change in myself about the ability to not so much ability and awareness that I don't think I had ever granted myself before, having to like really crank out a lot of it every day. And so that I think was a natural fit. The being familiar to the department, I think, was big. But that's not to say there wasn't an internal talent contest of sorts. So yeah, we had had auditions, and we kind of made up a bunch of basically pilot episodes with different hosts, and basically went to the editor-in-chief and the deputy editors, and they had to listen, and hey, I won. So that's how
Your voice acting.
Yeah,
What's
well,
the
it was the ability to emote on demand.
Yeah, it's a skill.
But yeah, I mean, that was really just the sort of the outset of it, the actual making it happen. And it was very good to be in on the ground floor. And, it's not just a matter of, you can say, do a daily podcast, but I mean, what does that entail? What is the field going to be? Who is the intended audience? We want to get certain people in the door as subscribers and so on, but is that the same overlap of the people who are more likely to be podcast listeners? And we spent a lot of time scratching our heads and stroking our chins and trying things out, and just kind of like evolving it. Always, of course, with the approval of the powers that be and so on. But it felt very much like starting it, opening it up a new kind of chapter without being too grandiose, and having real flexibility. And a lot of the conventions, a lot of the ways that we go about things were set then, and maybe there were things that we didn't think anything about. I understand, and maybe people who are watching this know this. I have come to learn that. So I do the top bit, right? Today we'll be talking about the second thing. Then we'll be talking about this third thing. But first we'll be talking about the first thing, right? And then goes into the first one. I either say, but first, or first up though. Apparently people out there pay very close attention about which of those things that I say. It's become a real thing. People are constantly commenting on Twitter of, about like, oh, I always try to guess if it's going to be but first or first up though. We didn't think about that. It was just we need a couple of linking words. And yeah, it's become a thing. One of the producers jokes that we should get t-shirts that say but first on one side and first up though on the back.
I mean, merchandise is always a great way to go when you've got people. Yeah, that's
any monetization we can find.
Well, the thing is with podcasts, that's like a very new platform that has kind of evolved in journalism. And I'd say 10, 15 years ago, that it wasn't really something that people thought you could monetize. And if you look at a lot of the news now, it's a great revenue stream for a lot of companies.
Absolutely.
So, but you mentioned about how you were kind of a science nerd potentially before. We had a question from someone watching who said that news and journalism, they have their distinct categories. What advice would you give to those who are trying to find their niche within this? So whether that be a food writer or a technology whiz or a political correspondent, someone who knows that they want to be a journalist, but what if they like it all? How can they find their niche?
I'm a little wary of the advice, write what you know, because it's limiting for one thing, because you might only know a small subset of things and have great interest in others. That makes it a great way to start. It gives you some comfort. It takes away the terror of the empty page and so on. But at the same time, in the course of being a science journalist for on the order of 10 years, some of the best science journalists I ever worked with didn't start out in science, don't have formal science training, which is which is just an anathema to somebody PhD trained in science. Like, oh, you can't talk about this stuff. Well, they can, in part because it's a lot about storytelling. So that's all that to say that. Writing what you know, it gets you somewhere, right? It gives you some confidence, but don't be limited by it. In terms of choosing from a vast palette of options, I think people ought to be honest with themselves about what it is they really like, because the one thing that will make it much easier to do is to really just simply be interested in what it is, right? I don't think everybody's honest with themselves about what they want to do versus what they think they ought to do. If you close the laptop and then you find yourself, kind of reading all sorts of stuff about food, then maybe you shouldn't be working so hard to become, a tech journalist, say. I think just find your passion, because it's one of those things that is weirdly obvious in the copy that you get, in the kinds of ideas that you get, the kind of dogged reporting that you see. When somebody is really into a topic, then it counts. So I would say, if there's some advice there hidden in all of that, it's be honest with yourself about what it is that really interests you, and channel it. And don't be afraid ever to kind of step outside your comfort zone if it is something that interests you. I certainly wrote lots of stories in my time about stuff that I didn't at the outset know In fact, let me spin that into sort of broader advice. A lot of times along the way, I ended up taking jobs, taking commissions for things that I wasn't sure I could do. I was kind of sure, but I was not certain I could do it. And given earlier advice of never break a promise, always file on time, what have you, that puts you out on a ledge, right? To do something, and I'm not quite sure I can do that. But I have found, and I think a lot of people I know and have worked with have found that like putting yourself out on that ledge does bring out the best in you. So I've turned this into a much bigger answer than you were looking for in the first place.
No, it's helpful to more students than just a niche. But would you say that your science and technology background has potentially helped, or did it hinder your journalistic style of now being a more broader political, economic, world news reporter?
Um, hmm. I would say early on in the science stuff, having been a dyed-in-the-wool scientist was actually a bit of a hindrance in the sense that, in the academic literature, the detail is king. The all of the work that came before it has great primacy and must be referenced and what have you. And, for a 400 or a 600 word news story, you don't have to bring a sort of, master's thesis level of information or detail to it. And so I think I basically had to teach myself, how not to get mired in the weeds. In a broader sense, though, that scientific training and science journalism training, I think, is really good, if for no other reason than, and I don't know if it's just science, really, it's academia more generally. You have to parse a lot of information. You have to read a lot of papers. You have to kind of go through a great deal of literature and find out which are the bits that are important to me, which are the bits that are important to my line of research. If you kind of make that an analogy with, here's a story, there is a fire hose of information shooting at my face, how to kind of like capture the good bits, how to kind of to be able to read a piece of news just like an academic paper and know and people who are watching this will know exactly what I mean. When you look at a paper and all you need to do is get like a third of the way through the abstract and you go, nah, or this is going to be extremely helpful to me. Like that kind of facility with parsing information was hugely helpful, remains hugely helpful.
One of the questions that was asked was, are there any particular skills or experiences that you developed during your studies that have helped you succeed in your career? So I feel like that links on quite nicely about noting, being able to pinpoint when something is helpful or not. But do you have any other, could you link any of the things from your PhD and your molecular physics to what you do now?
I hate to disappoint you. I think that is the single greatest one, because I mean, these are in the Venn diagrams of jobs. There's not a whole lot of overlap there. No, it's no. I would be making something up, because the truth is the biggest thing that I actually miss from those days is I actually did something with my hands. I used to make stuff and make stuff happen.
What do you mean? You made, like, you would write?
No, well, like I was an experimentalist, and so like I spent many lonely hours in the lab making things happen and so on. I think I've now turned that into cooking and making cocktails.
Yeah, so apparently you had a side gig at 1843. Someone said 1843 magazine as a cocktail correspondent. So someone asked, are you planning to take up this job again after lockdown? Of course.
Well, so I am still formally or informally associated with 1843 in a cocktail capacity. 1843 is essentially a sister magazine to The Economist, so it's essentially still in-house. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a lifestyle kind of magazine, and so there's a certain amount of appetite for food and drink writing, and I tried very much to make myself their drink writer. So will I be taking it up after lockdown? I will write as many stories as they want from me about cocktails, because it's good fun. It makes a nice change.
Yeah, and I feel that's quite important, that you are doing something that you enjoy. It's really nice to hear an adult professional who really loves what they do and like isn't bored of it. We have a question from Richard, who said, "What's your favorite cocktail?"
I hate picking favorites. Shall I just pick one? I'll just pick one of the favorites. I mean I think you have different favorites based on different base spirits, but I feel like we might be getting a little bit far afield of the intended discussion. So I'm a big fan of one called a Vieux Carré. That's the New Orleans mispronunciation of the French words. It's equal parts cognac, sweet vermouth, and rye whiskey with a bar spoon of Benedictine and Peychaud's and Angostura bitters, and it is a princely drink.
And have you written an article on that one, or?
You know what? I wrote an ode to the Vieux Carré as my sort of audition piece for 1843. Yes, it never got printed, but yes.
That's a shame. You
I
should
waxed
ask.
lyrical about it.
That sounds lovely. Well, the next question was, what's your proudest piece of work? So potentially the ode or contribution that you've made during your career.
I would have to say, science nerdery. Not long after I got onto Espresso, I had been pushing to do a piece on quantum technology. So basically, actual technological things, actual useful stuff based on some of the weirdnesses of quantum mechanics, namely quantum computing, which a lot of people will have heard about and so on. I wrote it up in short form, expecting it to be sort of 2 or 3 pages in the paper. And long story short, there was enough meat there to merit something bigger. Was asked if I wanted to do it as what was then called Technology Quarterly, I think still is called, which is 9,000 words, which is like 10 pages in the paper. And sure. So I did. And we do like sort of big deep dive things on, sometimes, not pieces of the greatest, widest appeal. So I thought, here's a great opportunity to bring some like real hardcore nuts and bolts science nerdery to, writ large. And the most wonderfulest thing happened. The editor-in-chief liked it so much, like emailed me when she finished reading it and said, "This is amazing. I want to put it on the cover." And
wow.
that was my first and last so far cover article. And the more important thing is that it is kind of a nascent field, right? It's kind of a field where there's a bit of hype and there's a bit of venture capital and there's a bit of sort of toes in the water amid business. And this was already 3 years ago. Things have moved on since, but point being, it wasn't sufficiently established that a cover story in The Economist did make a difference. And I've just since heard from so many people in that field that getting that kind of prominence and having the sort of the full scope and the opportunity that represents from a kind of a business standpoint, having that there in The Economist kind of gave the whole field a kick in the pants. And I love that idea that it's kind of helped people not only to understand the nuts and the bolts, but also the opportunity. I heard in particular about there was a Canadian conference just for kind of like getting their quantum technology business, their involvement at a government level kind of off the ground, and how to invest properly and do the kind of state-backed tech development type stuff. Big conference, big important people, and apparently as you get your kind of your badge and what have you, they had a stack apparently of copies of The Economist where this was the cover article. This is like, wow. This is your guide to this thing. Here you go. So yeah, I mean, I would say that's proudest because a lot of stuff just gets read and forgotten, right? And then some stuff makes a niche. I'll grant you a niche difference, but a difference.
How did I guess, like when you were doing your PhD, you're used to writing dissertations and things like that. How did your dissertation compare to this 10,000 word piece? Often when I ask questions like this, a lot of the time they're like, "Oh, all the exams that I did there, I'm really proud of those." And like, how do they compare your PhD to that article?
I was really excited to write that article.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
No, I think they're just like fundamentally different things, and and one was the subject of 4 years work, and one was well, I mean, I suppose like it drew on more than 4 years worth of reporting. They're just fundamentally different things, and again, that kind of harks back to this talk about like how science writing was far harder than writing science, as an academic and so on. So yeah, I think kind of incommensurate really. Was it more or less a pain in the butt? It was more of a joy.
That's nice. That's lovely. We've got an interesting question, a little bit deeper. How lockdown has affected you, as podcasting is a slightly isolating job?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the fact that I spend all of my working life in this room and sometimes in that closet there, a fair old bit in that closet actually. It is, but I have it very, very good pragmatically speaking, in that, I've got a partner downstairs who I can bounce ideas off of. I have a great team of people who are furiously active on Slack at most hours of the day. We've got, kind of friends in the neighborhood. In terms of the isolation, I don't. It's more boring than it is isolating, I suppose.
Mhm.
And so far anyway, haven't had any sort of felt any kind of real negative effects aside from deadly boredom.
Do you think that when COVID-19 is done, say in a few years or potentially after the vaccine, do you think you'll be going back into an office, or are you quite happy? I know a lot of people are happy working from home, or if you feel quite content. Or...
I think probably I fall in the camp of quite a lot of people. I'd like a mix. I just like it to
Mhm.
be a little different here and there. On days that it's more convenient and I'm waiting for a delivery, then I'll stay home. On days when I don't want to make my own lunch and clean up from it, then I'll go to work. I think kind of a mix would be very welcome. There's the sort of the troubling thing is the certainty that you can't or you shouldn't, or it's against the law to go to work.
Mhm.
Given some flexibility, assuming that anybody's got is going to keep the extremely expensive central London commercial real estate, right, and it continues to have an office for us to go into.
That's a very good point. What is one podcast that hasn't seen the light of day due to a breaking news story, or one that was never published, or that you wanted to be published? That's quite an interesting story. A question.
Not sure I understand. Things that we wanted to do, they just never ran.
Yeah, so a story that you were really proud of, but then have you ever had that where a breaking news has just completely pushed what you'd done aside, and then you've had
Right.
to...
Well, let's see. I think broadly you can say the ones that are most, had the most work go into them
Mhm.
are the ones that are not like the really newsy ones. The really newsy ones, but like I say, we recorded at 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning, and it goes out by 11. The ones you really put your life and your heart and soul into and so on tend to be like those sort of like second stories. So if it gets pushed out by the news on a given day, you just sort of reschedule it. Maybe you rewrite the top
Okay.
to make it. We don't waste much. There's too much work to get done. There's too much work that goes into these things that things get wasted unless, at the end of the day, we tried to make something of this, or the news gets out, it sort of outpaces and makes something outdated. But overwhelmingly we use what we've got because it's also hard won.
Yeah, I can imagine as well with news coming in all the time. Do you have to work on the weekends quite often, or are you quite strict with no, I'm not available on the weekends?
I try to be strict, and the truth is that when we have sort of something big breaks over the weekend, that most often the most of that work will fall to one of the editors and one of the producers to prepare for Monday. So I'm very lucky in that I get off the hook. I mean, we often kick around ideas. We have a little WhatsApp group and talk about what the important stories are, and hey, do you think we should lead on this or that, and so on. And that in turn is is discussed with others in the department. But no, I sure as hell don't work as much on weekends. So
Okay.
I
And I guess,
count that as a win.
yeah, no, definitely. That's good that you've got your breakaway. But I'm aware we're coming to the end of the time. So that does bring question time to a close. If we didn't have time to answer your questions, then please feel free to reach out to Jason through LinkedIn and his Twitter. All his contact information is in the description box of the YouTube live stream. I'd like to close this keynote with a huge thank you to Jason, who has kindly given his time today to share his wisdom and experience with us. I hope you've all found this webinar helpful. And if you have any questions about the King's Business Review or future keynotes, do not hesitate to get in touch and continue to comment your questions in the comment section, or send us a message on our Instagram account at King's Business Club. Don't forget to share this webinar with your networks. And once again, thank you to Jason for joining us today, and thank you for listening.